If I've done this right, everybody have a full screen view of men on an outrigger canoe? All
Yes, we
right.
do. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to do this today in kind of a storytelling fashion. I very much want to tell you the story, kind of the narrative of the artist Arman Manookian, but I also want to weave in the story of how I learned about him. It's a story about research. So let me start with that. About 20 years ago now, I'm trying to think back. Yeah, it was almost exactly 20 years ago. I bought a painting in a thrift store in Dana Point, California. And some of you may do this. Maybe if you're in the art field, you buy something now and then and think that has some quality. I bought a Philippine painting and I sold it on eBay. And I think I made about $20 on the painting. I didn't make much profit. But I met a man who later told me, he said, well, I'm a dealer in Philippine painting and I also deal in Hawaiian painting. So we started an email friendship, which is still going on. We're still in touch with each other. And after I'd known him about a year, he asked for my mailing address, and in the mail came a check for $1,000. And he said, John, I know you're a professor, and I'd like you to do research on Arman Manookian, because he's an artist that we talk about quite a bit in Hawaii. And one of the things we talk about is that we know next to nothing about him. His life is really a mystery. So I thought that was a great challenge. I cashed the $1,000 check and I thought, well, I'll spend a week or two on this. Maybe I'll make some phone calls. Maybe I'll go to the library, see what I can find. And I did get some clippings from Hawaii. I got this clipping about Manookian's suicide. And to make a long story short, I did research for about a year and a half. I just kept going and going and going because I kept making discoveries and the story kept getting more interesting. And that's how this narrative came together. But there was only one contemporary account or recent account of Manookian when I was working. A man named Ron Ronk was a newspaper reporter in Honolulu, had written a kind of a short feature article. And this is a quote from his article. He said that when Manookian died at the age of 27, that shockwaves went through Honolulu's creative community and left a legend and a lingering mystery. And of course, reading that enticed me even more. What is the lingering mystery? What is the story behind this man? When I was doing the research, Google was new. The internet was maturing. Yahoo was my main search engine, but I had gone to a presentation about Google. I'd heard about it for the first time, and I thought, what's going to happen when I Google Arman T. Manookian? And after a lot of wasting my time and after a lot of Googling, I eventually found a man named Patrick Manookian in Paris who was a member of a chess club. And his name was spelled differently. It was Manou rather than double O. But there seemed to be a connection to Arman. So I contacted the head of the chess club and he said, oh yeah, Patrick, he was just here. Let me give you his cell phone number. We got his cell phone number and a French speaking friend called the cell phone number for me. And the story goes that when Patrick picked up the phone, there was one of those uncomfortable silences, kind of a glitch in the call. And he said to my friend in French, he said, no one's spoken to my uncle for decades. How on earth did you get my cell phone number? So it was one of these things. It was a connection that had been gone for a long, long time. And Google and internet research brought back the connection and brought back the story. And this is the story that another friend collected for me. I had a friend in Paris who went and interviewed Manookian's sister-in-law, who was still alive, and also his nephew. And they pieced together quite a bit of his story. The Manookian family was a very, very well-educated, prosperous family. And Manookian's paternal grandfather had been a merchant in Manchester, England, where there was a colony of Armenians. And they were in Constantinople, this great city that is between continents. It's a port city. It's a city where all kinds of cultures come together, not always well at the time, because there was there was Ottoman rule over the city. And I started learning a little bit about Constantinople as I did my research. And there's so many interesting things about the city. As you look at this photo of the Armenian Quarter, there was kind of a core of, Armenian families that lived on a couple of main streets in Constantinople. One of the facts I learned is that there were no addresses in the city. It was kind of medieval in one sense. The postman had to know the names of the different families or businesses to deliver mail, and nobody bothered with numbers. So it was like it was both a big city and a small town. This is not the Manookian family, but it's an archival photo. It's a photo of an Armenian family in Constantinople. And I want to briefly say that the Armenians were Christians. So in that sense, they were obviously different from the Islamic leaders of the city. There had been a long history of harassment and persecution of the Armenians because, like the European Jews, they tended to be literate, educated. I mean, obviously, especially in the cities. Many of them, did very, very well, had considerable wealth, and they were resented. And one anecdote I found said that into the end of the 19th century, the Sultan's guards would occasionally behead an Armenian downtown just to show that they were in charge without penalty. So there had been various, I'm going to say, small skirmishes and disasters and oppressive events that came along during the years that were part of the history of every Armenian family. So it didn't surprise me to hear from the family that when young Tateos was growing up, this was the young man's name, he was named after the Saint Tateos. Theodore, I think is how you translate it, or Tad would be another way to say it. But he grew up, in this tense kind of culture. He was very, very impressed by the appearance of the Great White Fleet when Teddy Roosevelt sent it into Constantinople as a show of power, I think in maybe 1905, 1906. And apparently as a little boy, the first thing he drew were American ships. He drew the ships of the Great White Fleet, and the family still has some of those drawings. Both Tateos and his brother Vahe were altar boys at a church, and they certainly grew up with the kind of finery and the illuminations and the imagery that had a Byzantine flavor that came out of the Armenian culture. So I show that to kind of, give you an idea how his artistic side might have developed in church. And then a really remarkable connection that I found in doing my research is I found out that this man, Daniel Varujin, was the principal of the school that Manookian attended as a boy. And this man is he's considered today a major Armenian poet, one of the greatest revival poets of Armenia. And he was a nationalist. Part of what he said in terms of his spirit of being an Armenian, he worshiped the Armenian spirit, and he said that it's alive, but it appears only occasionally in history. And he declared, without the Armenian spirit, there's no Armenian literature. And every true artist expresses his own race's spirit. So you can see very nationalistic, very, very proud in his sentiments. And he would have influenced young Tateos. I think we are all hearing more now, especially after the recent recognition by the Biden administration of the Armenian Genocide. We're hearing more about the events. But as it relates to Manookian's life, April 24th, 1915 was a kind of a day of ethnic cleansing, and the Turks very much targeted the male leaders, 15 years and older, of Armenian culture, the businessman, the merchants. Tateos's father was a newspaper publisher, and his mother, by the way, had come from a family of Bible publishers. So what happened for Arman's or Tateos's father is that he and his brother were able to hide in the printing company and then later escape to France. So the young man, he did not lose his father on that terrible day. However, you can see here with my Wikipedia entry, the principal of his school, I'll tell you how he died. His head was crushed between two rocks and he was flayed alive. It's unbelievable. I don't know how I even said that, but principal of his school was killed. So were, I think, the leading fathers of many of the families that he knew. And this was a time of absolute horror for a young man who would have been 11 years old when this happened. Obviously, in the years that went by, there was considerable tension and despair. Manookian's mother put together a large sum of money and decided to send her son, as he matured a few years later, for safety, to send him to the United States. And here's a photo of some Armenians coming in at Ellis Island. I'm going to call him Arman now, because when he came to the United States, he signed in at Ellis Island. I actually found his document because they have an online document search. He came in as Arman Manookian and used the two O's. And I think Arman Manookian, when you take the name Arman, it's almost like saying young Armenian man, as a nickname. But Arman Manookian came in, and he stayed with relatives who had an umbrella repair business in Providence, Rhode Island. And of course, the United States had many, many Armenian orphans flooding in. The most famous artist that came in was, of course, Arshile Gorky, whose real name was not Arshile Gorky. He didn't even tell his first wife that he was Armenian. She didn't find out until they were divorced. She always thought he was a Russian, because to be Armenian, it was almost like, admitting you came from poverty and shame and disaster. So anyways, he came to Providence, Rhode Island, and I think that he and his brother must have both planned to be in the newspaper business, to work in their family newspaper, because his brother later became an engraver, and young Arman studied illustration, and he got a scholarship to the Providence, Rhode Island, the School of Fine Arts. He lived for a while at the YMCA. And it's amazing what you can now do with internet research. I contacted the Rhode Island School of Design, and they still had his grade records. So I found out what teachers he'd studied with, what his grades were. They had a full record of him, and later published a short article about him in their alumni paper. So he was becoming an Armenian-American, finding a new way forward. And the man that really gave him opportunity was this man, Major Edwin McLellan, who is, I think, a grandson of the Civil War general McLellan. And McLellan was a historian. And when Manookian came under his supervision, he saw that the young man had artistic talent, and he put him to work doing illustrations. McLellan had this project that he was going to write an 800-page history of the US Marine Corps. And he did eventually write it, but it never got published. And there's one copy known of. The New York Public Library has his manuscript. So the Manookian illustrations are there, and the original text is there. But in other words, young Manookian got roped into this huge historical project. And that was where he really, there's his boot camp photo, by the way, where he really, began to blossom as an illustrator and use the skills that he had learned at the Providence School, the Rhode Island School of Design. But there he is. There are two known photos of him. So this is one of them. And you can see he's a young jarhead, lost his hair, has big ears. He was not a tall man. I think he was maybe 5'5" or 5'6". He also, through McLellan, got a job doing illustrations for Leatherneck, which was the Marine Corps and still is the Marine Corps magazine. And I went down to Camp Pendleton and found these on microfiche and enlarged them. Because of the historical work he was doing for McLellan, he did a lot of scenes of early Hawaii. So that cover you see there is his fantasy of Captain Cook coming to the shores of the Sandwich Islands before they were Hawaii and being greeted by natives. But you can see from what he did up at the top there that he was a pretty good contemporary pen and ink illustrator. And I was really charmed when I found this little self-portrait that Manookian did for Leatherneck, and he's now using his monogram, Arman Tateos Manookian, ATM. And you can see he's portraying himself as kind of a scholar and a book illustrator. And that's very, very much in line with this Armenian tradition of St. Gregory the Illuminator. He had gone to St. Gregory the Illuminator school in Constantinople. Here's a little cover he did for a Pearl Harbor magazine in 1926. And it's another kind of a Captain Cook fantasy where one of the British sailors has got the topless girls, but they look a little bit like 1920s flappers, which shows that he's kind of between eras there, but he did the lettering, he did the tiki, did that line work. Hawaii in the 20s was changing, but not as rapidly as it would in the 30s. Hawaii really began to change when the Pan American Clipper started landing there in the early 1930s. You still, in the 20s, you had to get there on the Matson line, maybe take the Lurleen out of San Francisco was the port that most people took. But it definitely was a roaring 20s kind of glamour destination. And, Charlie Chan movies and Shirley Temple movies were beginning to be shot there. There were new hotels going in, like the Royal Hawaiian, big pink hotel that's still down there, opening in 1927. So I think it would have been a really, really interesting era to be in Honolulu. And for a young Marine like Manookian, it was the best assignment ever. And in some things he wrote, he just talks about the fact that he can't believe that, anybody and everybody who could wouldn't make their way to Hawaii because it was such a great paradise. There was a local art scene. The Honolulu Academy opened in the mid-1920s with sugar money. There was a lot of sugar plantation money coming into the islands, the Spreckles money, the Irwin money. He joined the Honolulu Artist Association and was, a member along with maybe half a dozen artists that you would have considered modern. I saw evidence that he attended a lecture by a French visitor on Gauguin in 1927. So people have said, did Manookian know Gauguin's work? Well, absolutely he did. Admired that work and admired the color and exoticism of it. And there certainly would have been artists who were getting reputations for portraying the phenomena, the volcanoes, the palm trees, the landscape of Hawaii. Howard Hitchcock was a famous one who had a studio in Honolulu where you could buy his paintings there. Jules Tavernier was a painter who worked in San Francisco and Honolulu and was a specialty in volcanoes. And then a good friend of Manookian's, another member of the Art Association, was John Melville Kelly, who made the what we call it, the menus for the Matson liners. He was also an illustrator. And newspapers played a big role in Manookian's developing career because he got a job at the Honolulu Star Bulletin. There were two papers, the Advertiser and the Star Bulletin. And one of his co-workers, along with John Melville Kelly, was a man by the name of Don Blanding. So when Manookian had a show in 1927, now discharged from the Marines, he got a very good review from Don Blanding. And this is one of the paintings he actually showed. And he was praised for strong, vibrant color, which is not garish, fantastic abstract form. It was a very, very positive review. And I'll tell you a little bit later in the lecture, I think to most tourists and to most people in Hawaii, they wouldn't have wanted this type of painting. They would have wanted a Hitchcock painting. They would have wanted something more real and more conventional. So he was a shockingly bold and modern young artist. Just to tell you a little bit about Don Blanding, because he was the critic that helped advance Manookian's career. I even found a couple of clippings in the newspaper where they were bantering with each other. There's this funny one where it goes, "What would you think," said Manookian, "of a guy who wore red knickerbockers?" He says, "I'd say he was crazy," replied Don Blanding. But Don Blanding was a gay man from Minnesota who was a kind of a self-styled aesthete. He called himself the vagabond poet, and he made Art Deco style illustrations, which were his very, very popular books like Vagabond House. And I was in the antique store down here in Cambria a couple of days ago and saw a row of Don Blanding books. I think they were very good sellers, very, very popular. So again, he was someone that maybe played a role in popularizing Manookian's work. Manookian got lots of opportunities in public, in the newspapers, to let people know what he was doing. That's how he became a public figure. And I found this little clipping. He actually, explains how he does his work. And I think that second paragraph is kind of interesting. He says, first of all, the work is not modern. He says, those souls who have been shouting modern and ultra modern do it because they may be at a loss to grasp its significance. So he was, walking a little bit backwards from being modern. In other articles, he talked about how his real intention was to make symphonies of color. He saw himself as a colorist. He got an opportunity to display a large cycle of murals later in the 1920s, I think in 1928. He had a friend named George Gerasimos who had a watering hole, I'll call it, called the Green Mill Grill. And you want to remember that part of this era overlaps with Prohibition, but there was a lot of under-the-counter drinking going on. And Manookian apparently, traded for meals and also probably for whiskey at the Green Mill Grill, a lot of partying going on. He and George Gerasimos could both complain about the Turks because the Greeks and the Armenians both had beefs with the Turkish people. They had some things in common. And in the Green Mill restaurant, Manookian got to hang this painting that you see below, kind of an Armenian, Hawaiian, Byzantine Adam and Eve, I think would be what I would call it. And this was right across the street from the Hawaii Theater. And just to kind of set the stage, the Hawaii Theater, where all of the prominent Honoluluans and tourists would have gone, had a neoclassical mural by Lionel Walden over the stage. And the story goes that one night, two high society ladies, Muriel Damon was one of them, they had seen an event at the Hawaii Theater. They came across the street and they came to the Green Mill Grill. And one of them was Helene Irwin Crocker Fagin. And let me just say, she's a webinar unto herself. I really am sorry that I'm only going to give her, 1 minute, but let me give you kind of a sketch of her. She was one of the richest women in America. And she was wealthy because of her sugar inheritance. Her father, and this is actually true, it's hard to believe, but her father actually won the island of Lanai with a partner in a poker game from the King of Hawaii in the late 19th century. So there's all kinds of backstories there, but her father had been a sugar baron who left her $13 million in the early 1920s. She had other inheritance, and she married a member of the Crocker family. Their mansion in Pebble Beach is still there. It's a Byzantine-style mansion with a black marble bathtub that you can see online. She was an art collector. She was a patroness, and she also donated considerably to the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco. So she saw the Manookian murals along with her friend Muriel Damon, and she said, let's buy them. And they bought and divided up the murals, and the Manookian paintings stayed in these two families until very, very recently. So here are some of the murals that would have been in the Green Mill Grill. They were, again, very bold and colorful for their era. You can see that working for McLellan had given Manookian this kind of sharp illustrational style. He added color to that. He added an Art Deco vibe. And they were very, very bold. This picture went to the Damon family and later was in the Hana Maui Ranch Hotel until probably about 18 years ago when the hotel was sold. You can see that it really has the feeling of a kind of an Adam and Eve updated with a little dash of Art Deco. Red Sails is another painting that was at the Hana Maui Ranch. I understand that in the 1950s, that was a very, very popular honeymoon spot. You might want to talk to your, look up where your grandparents were married. But anyways, these bold Manookian paintings, Red Sails were there. And I always like to point out, I think it's interesting when you look at the colors, when you look at that deep blue, the ultramarine blue and the deep red of the Red Sails painting, I kind of see the Armenian flag. But that's just me. But, his color sense is definitely there. This painting, Men in an Outrigger Canoe, is kind of considered Manookian's masterpiece. That's why I put it on the cover of today's presentation. It also set the record for Manookian price. It sold for about $250,000 in a private sale some years ago. There are, by my count, there are 31 Manookian paintings known, maybe 32, but it's very, very rare that new ones show up. But his major oil paintings like this one bring very, very significant prices in Hawaii, even though people here on the mainland don't often know who Manookian was. He's still kind of a new character because there's so little of his art and his art hasn't traveled much. There's the Fagin Ranch. The Fagin Ranch, Helene Crocker Irwin remarried. She divorced Templeton Crocker in the late 20s and got the house, got part of the fortune, and then settled on, or had one home on Maui with her new husband, a banker named Paul Fagin. And there are the Manookians in their living room, where visitors saw many of them for years. This is an interesting comparison. I just want to go through now and show you some of Manookian's paintings and let you get a feeling for what his art looked like. This is a pathway in Manoa that I located a photo of, and here's the painting he did of it. And you can see that he really was using the Hawaiian countryside. What I say about Manookian is he really started out as an illustrator, and then I think Hawaii made him an artist. Hawaii gave him a subject matter that transformed him and took what he did from being a commercial artist really to being a fine artist. I've called him, Hawaii's Van Gogh, because of the way that Hawaii changed him, almost in a way like Provence changed Vincent van Gogh. It sharpened his aesthetic sense of the world. Another way that Manookian built a reputation is his paintings, like this painting of a rice field, gouache painting, appeared on the cover of Paradise, the Pacific magazine. I think most people have forgotten that magazine now, but it was kind of a competitor to National Geographic. It was a very beautifully produced, colorful magazine that gave people a view of Paradise. So he was on the cover. His images were often featured in that, featured in Paradise the Pacific, also rerun in Leatherneck. Here's a picture of another gouache painting that was published after his death in a 1937 issue of Paradise the Pacific. A kind of an Art Deco image of Maui staring the sun that appeared in that magazine. And you can just see how, again, how sharp and refined his line was. Again, probably growing up, always thinking he'd be an illustrator for his father's newspaper before life, changed that. There are a number of his pencil sketches around. He used to sketch the sugar refineries, the shorelines, the huts, the boats floating down in the harbor. Very, very good with a pencil, very refined and efficient in the way he drew. And then as we go through the presentation, you're going to see that over time, his style became a little more, a little bolder. The color and the way he used the rhythms of the color became even more stylized, like in this picture of two houses in Kahala. If you look at the trunk of that tree, there's a little Cezanne there. The way he tried to really, really emphasize the volume of that tree trunk with gradations of color. Another beautiful little painting of the shoreline at Aliwai with stylized trees looming in the background. I found some clippings that talked about traveling he did. He was someone, he never settled down. From what I understand, he usually lived with friends, rented a room, traveled, came back to town, stayed with the Marines. But I found a clipping about a week he'd spent in Puna, Hawaii, which you see here on this old postcard. And that apparently gave him information for a lot of his later paintings, because his subject matter later really, really turned to Native Hawaiians and fantasies about how they lived. I want to say that one of the things I notice about Manookian is that he really was kind of the opposite of a realist. His attitude, I think what he brought to his art was really about a kind of a fantasy. And you might even say that his paintings were heartbreakingly beautiful, I think is one way to look at them. Everything was taken to the next level of perfection. It was full of Arcadian feeling, very, very idyllic pictures, like this one, inspired by a Japanese screen that belonged to the Damon family. Beautiful colorist as well. Hawaiians making poi. Strong outlines. I love that outline of the white tree trunk in the background as the man looks up at you a little suspiciously while pounding the poi. These do have a feeling like Gauguin. A fisherman. Kind of let these speak for themselves. I just put in as many late paintings as I could find. This one exists in both an ink drawing and a painting. Pele, the goddess of fire, maybe modeled on an older woman, a shamaness that he found. So I started to, as I was really getting further in my research, I'd sometimes get an email from somebody or I'd get a call from somebody, and there were for a few stories. I interviewed one woman who was an elderly woman who had taken a painting lesson with him. And I said, what do you remember about your painting lesson with Arman Manookian? And she told me two things. One was that he was very kind to her in the beginning and that he gave her a paint box. But the second was, on one of the lessons, he got frustrated with her and picked her up by the hair. And I thought, wow. Yeah, I mean, that was her last lesson. Something was wrong. And I also heard stories that he was a binge drinker, a binge alcoholic. And when you read his records, he did have a desertion in his military record. He left a post one time. So there were many, many stories about him being erratic, as if something was wrong with him. And just a few years after I wrote the article, I was contacted by a lady that had this painting in her family, and I arranged for this to go to an art dealer. But anyway, she told me the story behind the painting. Her grandmother had been a landlady that rented a room to Manookian, and she heard him having a fit one time, just yelling and screaming and throwing things, and went downstairs. He apologized and pulled the dresser away from the wall and got this painting out and gave it to her and said, I'm sorry for all the fuss I'm making. And that's how the family had gotten this painting. There's also a painting in a private collection in Honolulu where he apparently took it off the wall during an exhibit and tore it in half and then handed it back to someone. So you can see he's destroying his own work. He's having public outbursts, getting a reputation as being erratic. That's one of his last paintings, painting on paper that his family in Europe has. He was getting critical praise all the way into the 1930s. And for background, you want to remember the great stock market crash came in 29. My understanding is it didn't really hit Hawaii until 30 or 31, but that's when the tourism began to decline a little bit and the economy began to feel what was happening in the stock market and mainland. But the Depression had a delayed effect in Hawaii. Manookian had I don't know what to call her, a friend, maybe a girlfriend, maybe just a close friend named Verna Tallman, who was a Berkeley graduate that worked at the Bishop Museum. And they painted together. In 1930, they painted the same image of a woman at her stall. And the painting you see on the left was in Napa, California. And I was able to purchase that through a dealer when it was found, when I was doing my research. And that got donated to the Honolulu Academy after being restored. The woman who was the niece of Verna Tallman said that there was also a self-portrait that got destroyed because it was a very disturbing self-portrait, but her aunt had shepherded these things, held on to these things for many, many years. He had a commission at the Waipahu Theater, and there were apparently murals that he did over the drinking fountains. He did Hawaiian-style murals. I went to the Waipahu Theater, which was a Baptist church when I visited. It had been a theater, it had been a porno theater, been a Baptist church, it's been kind of everything. But if there are Manookian murals there, they're under a couple layers of woven cloth now, and I doubt they could be recovered. But that was his last major commission. He also did a painting. This painting of flamingos was done for a private man who wanted a mural for his home. It was recovered in the 1950s by some trash cans. It was put out in the trash in Oahu, and somebody picked it up, and it's now been restored. So that's a glimpse of some of Manookian's 31 paintings. And of course, I had to ask myself when I was trying to write an article, because I wanted to write an article for Honolulu Magazine, what did I think about his suicide? What could I learn about what happened? How could I kind of judge him? Here's what I learned. I learned that at the end of his life, he was living in this house. He was living downstairs, actually, behind that screen door you see there. And he was living with a couple. The man was an architect, and then his girlfriend was named Belinda. And the story goes that one night they had friends over to the house, and they were having a lively party, not lively party, probably with a lot of drinking. And they were playing murder in the front room. And as this happened, the door into the kitchen fell open, and Manookian fell forward onto the kitchen floor. And he apparently drank a photo developer, and the man who was an architect that was his landlord was a photographer. And he had taken this very last photo of Manookian, maybe in the weeks before. So you have to wonder, was it an intentional suicide? Was it an accident of somebody reaching for a bottle and drinking photo developer? Was it, jealousy and rage towards the friends who were having more fun than he was? Was there a triangle? I mean, you can speculate about all of these things. But I think the thing that I really came to understand as I did the research is I realized that as a young man that Manookian had seen things that no one should see. He had understood things that no one should understand. He had gone through the first genocide of the 20th century. And it has been said, there were German observers in Turkey when many of these actions happened, that in some ways the Armenian genocide was a sort of prelude to the Holocaust later in Europe. It was, all quite unimaginable. And I think the takeaway for me, whoever Manookian was as an adult, whoever he became, was that his childhood had shaped him and made him both the very sensitive artist that he was, who was searching for the ideal, who was searching for paradise, but it also made him very, very deeply wounded. And in the final article about him, there were 2 articles about his suicide that appeared in the paper. There was this description: he was shy and sensitive, not prone to follow convention. He was witty and ironic, but he remained a puzzle to his friends. And I think this is absolutely beautiful. This was read at his funeral, and I got a copy of the elegy that was read at his services a few years after doing my research. Incredible quote from Bertrand Russell from his diaries: "Art springs from the wild and anarchic side of human nature. Between the artist and the bureaucrat, there must always be a profound mutual antagonism, an age-long battle in which the artist, always outwardly worsted, wins in the end through the gratitude of mankind for the joy he puts into their lives." And I think that's the way to look at Manookian, is to look at the joy of his work. This is his brother Vahe and his sister Adrienne. His mother was also still alive in Europe when the news came. I understand that the family never really entirely came to terms with or understood the suicide. As an oldest son in an Armenian family, I'm sure they had high expectations for him, and he'd been given a lot of money when he left Constantinople. I'm sure they really hoped that he would rejoin them and be part of the family and maybe restart a family business. So the shock lingered for a long time. Here's one more quote from the man who spoke at his funeral. He was chiefly a colorist. He had the dream of creating color, a great symphony of beauty. He could do in color what Beethoven had done in music. This was a really nice outcome. So what happened was that after I did the research, I published an article in Honolulu Magazine, and that article got widely read. And in 2009, a friend sent me an email and told me this had happened, but Hawaii was head of the continental United States in terms of recognizing the Armenian genocide. They did it in 2009 with a House resolution. They have made April 24th a day of remembrance for the Armenian genocide. And in the language for that bill, they cited Arman Manookian. They cited his ties to Hawaii, his status as a genocide survivor, and his tragic death and legacy. And I thought that was really, really cool that he was cited in that remembrance. I thought that was a really nice thing to happen. It's very hard to see his paintings. I know that there's one in San Diego. It's the only one I know of here in California. All the others I know of are in Hawaii. Some have been sold recently. One of the estates has started selling some of his works, but you will occasionally see them. There are 3 in the collection of the Honolulu Academy, if you are ever there. And they had a show called Art Deco Hawaii maybe 5 years ago, where they had a few more Arman Manookian paintings. But this whole series that I've been doing for Martha, we've been trying to do lesser known artists, people that maybe you hadn't heard of yet. And that really was what the research on Arman Manookian did for me. It opened up an artist that I knew nothing about, that a lot of people knew nothing about, and it made his story, alive again, and made his art relevant and something for us to all be talking about. And with that, I think I'll leave the screen share and come back to you. I'm going to come back to the Zoom coffee table. You've all been sitting around, and let's talk about his art and your reactions and your questions. I say everybody should unmute and just say what's on your mind. We'll get a conversation going.